Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
In the 80s, my father, who was a rabbi, was part of a group of young religious leaders in Jerusalem, mostly all Orthodox, but very open Orthodox. There were rabbis, but also thinkers and journalists and activists and educators. And it was a very unique time in Jerusalem, a time of openness and of searching. And they were looking to take their religious lives into new directions. My father speaks about this group going and spending time at the time with the Gedolim, with the great ones of the generation who were still around from before the war and of that whole period, the established leaders, and asking them the big questions. Well, what is all of this about? Why are the whole Jewish path, where does it take us? Why are we doing this? And they found that the answers were not always as satisfying. We're not always giving them what they were searching for. But there was one Rebbitzin who had some answers. She taught them that what Judaism needed was to bring the tangible presence of holiness, of divinity, back into it. And one night she told all the group as they were seated together, who had all these questions and these thoughts about where to take Judaism forward in this new third period of Jewish history, post-Shoah, post the establishment of Israel. And she said to them, love your story. Love your story. Love your Jewish story. Love the story of where the Jewish people come from. And if you put yourself into it, then you will see where you need to go. As Jews, we often think of ourselves as the people of laws, of traditions. And we have really laws for everything. We have laws. Which shoelace to tie first in the morning? It's the right one, if you're wondering. And these laws have always been at the core, the pathways of our civilization, as Mordechai Kaplan, the leader and founder of the Reconstructionist movement, would say, Rabbi Kaplan. And they touch on every element of life. It's our laws to bind us together from the four corners of the world and to bind all of our different moments in our history together. And we pass them on to our children and our grandchildren, how we do Shabbat, each of us, how we each eat, how we do kashrut, the holidays, each in our own way. For millennia, it was how we dressed. So much was passed down. But perhaps we can say that even more than a people of laws, we are a people of stories. Stories of the Torah, rabbinic stories of the Talmud, the Hasidic stories. Because while the laws do teach us how to behave in certain situations, the stories tell us who we are and why we walk in the world as we do. And it's why one of the most important rabbinic questions that is threaded into our parashah goes back to the very first comment on the entire Torah. We have our Torah, and then we have thousands of years of commentary. And perhaps one can look to Rashi, the French commentator, as bringing all of those comments into one commentary, all those who preceded him. And he asks in the very first comment on the Torah, and he says, a question that we don't think about very often, but why does the Torah begin in the beginning with the creation of the world? Is the Torah not a book of laws? Shouldn't the Torah begin in this moment in our parsha where the children of Israel have left Mitzrayim, left Egypt, and God gives them the very first mitzvah, the very first Torah, very first commandment as a people to observe the Jewish calendar, the months. Torah, the word itself means instruction. So why not just start there? Then you really would have had a book of instructions telling you how to live. And so Rashi asking in that very first comment in Torah, why doesn't it begin here? He answers, because what we read about in creation, those stories, are very important. And what we read about in the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs are also important to what it means to be a Jew and walk in the world as a Jew. Because as we say, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, that the deeds of the fathers and of the mothers are a sign for us of how we live in the world. Because the stories teach us how to live. And we need the stories and how deeply they become part of our collective psyche. Adam and Eve and their eating of the apple and losing their oneness with God, which means that all of us are always trying to work back towards that oneness. And Abraham and Sarah leaving all that was familiar to go on a journey of meaning to the promised land. And all their struggles and their families and all the strife and how the Torah opens up the book for us to see all of it, so that we should not think that the challenges and struggles within our own worlds are unique, but that through all of those, the resentments, the jealousies, we are bringing tikkun, we're bringing healing to the world and to ourselves. Abraham arguing with God to save Sodom. The brothers who eventually put aside conflict and war to find love once again. And this morning, the story of the Exodus, of leaving Egypt, a story, perhaps there's no other story that's so deeply embedded in how we go about and think as Jews and act as Jews and be Jews. Avadim ha'inu, we were slaves. That was a long time ago, but it's still alive for all of us. Because it's the stories that tell us about our journey and about the nature of this world and about the nature of our relationship with the divine, and they tell us who we are, why we come into the world. And all the laws and traditions don't do that. It's the stories that answer all the great questions. So to be a Jewish person is not only to have a certain way of being in the world. A Jewish person is a person who holds certain stories at the center of their being. And that those stories are what direct how they live in all the endless mundane questions that come up in our lives. And they're different than the stories of other people that they hold in their hearts. Our stories, our central stories, are about fallible leaders who nonetheless, through all of their family lives, strive to understand themselves and the world that we live in. Stories of standing up for justice and of healing. And not all people hold on to the stories the way we do. We held on to the stories of the destruction of our temple for thousands of years, as in the famous story of Napoleon walking with a Jewish officer past a synagogue on Tisha B'Av and hearing the sound of lamentations and saying, why are these people so mournful and so sad? And the Jewish officer said, they're mourning the destruction of the temple. And he said, the temple, when was it destroyed? And he said, well, 1800 years ago. Napoleon thought if they're still mourning the destruction of the temple, then surely they will live to see it rebuilt. And for us in America, it's the stories of the Shoah that are so alive for us, and the stories of the establishment of the State of Israel. Even in America, and even as assimilated as our people have become here, we hold on to these stories into our collective identity. Stories that bring us close to our other stories. We are one people. And they are what make our relationship with God real for us. And those stories are what make our faith real for us, make our purpose real. And they manifest the past and make it come alive for us in the present and give us an identity that's profound and deep and real. And really, without our stories, who would care about the halakha, about the Jewish law? There's this debate in the academic field of biblical scholar criticism, where they debate, right, according to their view, they look into the origins of the Torah, and they debate, well, what came first in the Torah, the laws or the stories? What came first in the civilization of the people? And most argue that the stories came first, and out of the stories are where the laws came to be, all those distinct ways of being. And we see it so clearly in the story of Jacob when he wrestles with the angel all night long and is renamed Israel. And at the end, he comes out of it, and from his struggle, his leg is lame. And so the Torah says, because Jacob's leg became lame, we do not eat the sciatic nerve in animals. To this day, it is true. A story that gave birth to a tradition. In the end, because of the stories, is why we think about all the customs, and they bring us back to the stories themselves. So this morning we read about the story of the leaving of Egypt. And out of it, of course, we have the laws of Pesach, of matzah, of maror, of the lamb sacrifice, and the rituals connect back to this story. The Jewish law connects back to this story. But even more than all of that, we have Shabbat. Shabbat comes out of the story of the Exodus, a day of rest. Because as slaves, we know how precious that rest is. And we're commanded to give it not only to ourselves, but to everyone in our household, even to our animals, to those who work for us. And not only are we give Shabbat as a day of rest, but our fields are supposed to have rest. All of creation is embedded in rest. And it all comes out of this story. And out of this story comes our traditions and our laws of not mistreating the orphan, of taking care of the widow and the stranger, because we were strangers and we know that. Even though it happened thousands of years ago, it's still alive. The stories are the life force of the Torah. They're what bring our people life, or make our covenant seem real to us, even so long after. So when we read these stories of the Exodus, we're also reading about our origin, and we're reading about our present. And it's reminding us to love our Jewish story. And to remember to keep telling it to our families, and to keep telling it in ever deeper ways to ourselves, to keep them alive in our hearts and minds and souls. And so that when we come to times like these, times of struggle, times of uncertainty, that those stories and their depth and their life through the millennia can bring us comfort and strength and peace and faith, even in times such as ours. Shabbat Shalom.